The wind carried no sound that night, only the cold. It pressed in from the black tree lean like a siege, sifting through the seams of the cabin's oxidized plating and stirring the warped floorboards beneath Elias Rourke's boots. Outside, the ridgeline was buried under a 2-day snow, silver bright in the light of the dying moon. The kind of cold that bit through synth fleece and memory alike. The ridge was a dead zone now. Once, orbital strike maps had marked this place as Grid Alpha 847, an uplink corridor for tracking dissident exofrequencies. Now it was just ice, ruin, and the bones of old satellites buried beneath the tree line. Rourke's cabin stood on one of the last firm shelves before the escarpment dropped off into the timbered valleys below. No roads. No visitors. No ghosts unless you counted him. He sat by the stove, rifle disassembled across his lap, hands moving with the slow precision of a man who'd done the same motion 1,000 times. The heating filament crackled softly, a red coil in a dying nest of ceramic. Faint frost filmed the interior wall panels. Occasionally, they ticked, contracting with the cold. The cabin's walls were lined with scavenged plating, each sheet a different shade of oxidized steel, some still bearing faded hazard glyphs, others with pockmarks from micro-impacts. To a stranger it might look like collapse. To Rourke it was sanctuary. There had been no movement for weeks. No drone pings. No salvage requests on the broadcast channel. Just wind, stove, and silence. Even the ferals had gone east. Then the chime rang. Not loud, not sharp. Just a single, deliberate note, like glass tapped with a nail. The chime was old-world, mechanical, suspended from a braided line above the porch eave. It only rang if someone triggered the wire strung along the front steps. Nothing else could set it off. Not birds. Not wind. Not time. He didn't move right away. The habit was too deep. Pause. Listen. Watch. Let the nerves adjust. The porch camera had died last spring, a casualty of frost shearing off the mount. He hadn't bothered to replace it. Why would he? Nothing had approached the cabin perimeter in 3 winters. He reached for the top assembly of the rifle but paused halfway. Instead, he stood, slow and silent, and crossed to the door. His breath ghosted faintly in the air. The inner hatch creaked as it unsealed. When he opened it, cold rushed in like a breath held too long. The thing on the porch wasn't shaped right. Not at first glance. It lay in a half-collapsed heap against the threshold, cloaked in ragged thermoweave, limbs bundled close like a dying animal. Snow clung to it in wind-packed ridges. One arm, too long, jointed wrong, stretched toward the chime wire. Its fingers were curled inward, trembling faintly. Beneath the edge of the hood, a pulse of faint azure light flickered. Rourke didn't speak. Didn't raise his weapon. He just watched it breathe. It was breathing. He stepped closer, boots crunching against frostbit decking. The smell hit him first, not rot, but static charred metal and wet soil tinged with a trace of ozone. He knelt slowly. Closer now, the figure resolved into something almost human. Almost. Beneath the soot and ice, pale skin shimmered faintly with subdermal light. Its dermal surface was layered like translucent bark stretched over a lattice of muscle and glass. A single vertical ridge split its face, running from brow to chin, pulsing in slow, flickering rhythm. Embedded beneath the skin were clusters of photonic nodes, dim and flickering. He hadn't seen that kind of bioluminescence in 30 years. Yasari. The word alone made something tighten behind his ribs. Not fear, he didn't fear much anymore. Something colder. Older. Like the echo of a trigger pull. And then he saw the face, just a sliver, where the frost had peeled away from her cheek. For an instant, his vision blurred. Not from cold. He saw fire again. Red corridors. Screaming through his own neural uplink as his lance torched the hatchlings in the basilica at Ivan Crater. 17 years old and crying behind his visor while his hands kept shooting. He blinked hard. The cold returned. He stood and closed the door. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. He didn't check the chrono. Just paced. The stove clicked softly behind him. He checked the seals on the windows. Double-locked the inner hatch. His hands moved with practiced economy, but his mind was static. She'll be dead by dawn. The thought came not with urgency, but as fact. Like weather. Yasari. Not since the severance accord had anyone spoken that word out loud. Officially, the war had ended on the Decker line with the detonation of 7 planetary pulse nodes. Unofficially, the purge had continued for 3 more years in the dark, hunter squads, neurostatic deployments, field sterilizations. Rourke had served in the recon lance units sent to map the last colonies. He knew what extinction looked like. He unlatched the door again. Still there. Still curled. Still alive. One arm now bent back across its chest, protectively. Fingers twitching. He stepped forward and crouched. The thermoweave had once been military-issue, Terran colonial pattern, pre-accord. How had a Yasari come by it? He peeled back the edge. Beneath, the alien skin was cracked and ridged like scorched clay. Biogel had dried along the seams of her joints, forming brittle plates. The filaments beneath the skin flickered erratically. The kind of damage you saw in survivors of static field compression, neurofracture, sensory bleed, tissue collapse. Weapons he had carried. Targets he had marked. He let the thermoweave fall. He turned away. The rifle sat on the table, reassembled, loaded. His hand brushed across the grip, then moved past it. Opened the storage bin. Pulled out the old medpack. It still had one auto-injector loaded with stabilizers. He didn't think about it. He just moved. Like he had in the trenches. Like he had in the fire drop zones. He walked back to the porch. The figure didn't stir as he knelt again. He pressed the injector into the alien's side and triggered it. She spasmed. A low harmonic groan escaped her, high-pitched and layered, like broken wind chimes. Rourke dropped back, hand hovering at his belt for the sidearm. But the figure only shuddered, then fell still. The light in her faceplate ridge pulsed faster now. Erratic. Strained. But alive. He carried her inside. She weighed less than he expected. The thermoweave cloak slipped away as he laid her on the floor by the stove. Her limbs folded inward, delicate, sharp-edged things like the skeleton of a sea creature. Each hand bore 4 fingers, each ending in translucent, flexible digits with micro-tendrils that occasionally spasmed in unconscious reflex. A low-frequency purring noise emitted from her chest, irregular but present. Rourke crouched nearby, watching the rise and fall of her breath. He didn't speak. Just watched. Every memory wanted to rise, every blood-wet corridor, every burning outpost, every scream locked in a dead neural relay. But none came. Just silence. She wasn't human. But he couldn't let her die on his porch. He stood slowly, pulled the tarp off the second cot, cleared the old gear and ration tins, set up a heat coil near her feet. He covered her with the last intact survival blanket from his orbital drop kit. The biolights under her skin dimmed slightly, flickering into a steadier rhythm. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the window slats like fingers. The cabin creaked in its seams. The fire guttered, then steadied. For the first time in months, Elias Rourke didn't feel alone. Not safer. Not better. Just not alone. By morning, the wind had stalled. The forest below the ridge lay buried in silence, snow-draped, brittle, and untouched. The kind of silence that felt stretched thin, like the pause between heartbeats. Inside the cabin, Elias Rourke stood at the threshold of the sleeping area, arms folded, breath ghosting from his nose. The Yasari was still alive. She hadn't moved since he'd set her near the stove hours ago. The blanket still draped her like a shroud. Only the slow, rhythmic undulation beneath her ribs, barely visible beneath the pale mesh of her skin, confirmed it. The biolights embedded in her ridge glowed with a sluggish cadence, like a machine booting in recursive error. Rourke kept his distance. He'd run a scan. Crude, old gear, mostly scavenged comm diagnostics from his recon kits and what was left of his neurointerrogation tools, but it had done the job. The readings were all over the place, unstable biofeedback, neural cascade irregularities, spike echoes from a fractured neuroloop. Her pulse patterns didn't match anything in the Terran Med database. No match in old war files either. She was damaged. Still leaking trace energy. She hadn't come alone. That thought had rooted deep overnight. The static burns on her skin weren't from local weapons. He hadn't run signal interference for weeks, but a foreign burst signature had lit his sensor logs at 0200 hours. Short range, low orbit. He traced it as best he could, directional ping, likely from a high-altitude recon platform with Yasari spectral overlays. Either she'd been tracked or someone had tried to end her remotely. Someone had followed her or driven her here. The implications churned beneath his breath. The Yasari were extinct. If she existed, so might others. And if others existed, Earth Command would never allow a single one to surface. Not after the severance. Not after the vault fires. Any remnant was a liability, political, military, existential. He moved across the floor slowly, boots silent against the polymer boards. She stirred. Not awake, not aware. A ripple moved through her tendrils like wind over deep grass. Her face remained passive. No mouth, no eyes, just the ridge that flickered gently, a band of living circuitry embedded beneath transparent dermis. Her chest rose and fell in irregular rhythm, every few seconds catching like a skipped breath. The cabin smelled of old brass, dry oil, and smoke. A cracked ceramic mask, once ceremonial, now broken down the center, hung above the stove. His daughter had made it long ago. He hadn't looked directly at it in years. He paused beside the small workbench beneath the east window. Half the tools there were war-era scrap, dismantled uplink relays, coolant wires, a rusting data spike jammed into the wall like a reminder. The bench surface was worn smooth where his hands had cleaned rifles 100 times. One corner held a faded ration packet, half-eaten, its printed seal still marked with the 12th Caldera Division crest. He ran his fingers along the edge of the table, then filled a ceramic cup from the steam kettle. He crouched near her. The heat coil hummed quietly beside them. Her skin, where it peeked out from the thermal wrap, had changed texture, gone from brittle to soft and pearlescent. There were no wounds as he understood them, only damaged channels, burned sensory ports. Not meant for Terran environments. A faint scent emanated from her now, sharp and sterile like scorched stone and ozone. Heat radiated in low pulses from her chest. He reached for the blanket edge to adjust it. Ow. Her arm moved. Not fast. Not hostile. Just a slow, diagonal lift. The tendrils at her fingertips curled inwards, then flexed once. Light coursed faintly through her skin. She was conscious. Rourke froze, one hand still on the blanket. His eyes met the vertical slit of her face, not a gaze, not exactly. But her ridge brightened. The pulse steadied. He watched it glow and fade. Then she made a sound. Not speech. Not breath. A sequence of tones, soft, modulated, almost musical. It vibrated in the bones of his jaw more than in the air. Like subharmonics woven through static. He didn't respond. Just stood slowly. Backed away. She followed his motion with her head just slightly. Still too weak to rise. Her limbs quivered under her own weight. Her second pair of digits, articulated like insectal thumbs, twitched independently. He busied himself with the stove. Fed it a fresh energy cell. Checked the internal feed. Normal heat levels. Normal function. Nothing was normal. He hadn't spoken to another sentient being in 17 months. He activated the cabin's old solar uplink and routed it through the long-wave terminal. No return pings. Good. If she had a pursuer, it hadn't tagged him yet. The uplink tower, a rusted tooth antenna 20 meters up the ridge spine, was half frozen and blind to everything outside Terran channels. That would change once the sun returned to full arc. He watched her through the reflection in the window panel, how she shifted subtly, her limbs testing small degrees of movement. She examined the cabin without turning her head, mapping it through resonance rather than vision. One tendril occasionally rose into the air and froze as though sampling vibration. The glow across her ridge synchronized faintly with his footfalls. By midday, she was sitting upright. Barely. Wrapped in the blanket like a larval cocoon, limbs gathered tight. Her chest light glowed more evenly now, and she moved with more coherence, small adjustments of balance, testing the air, mapping the space. She hadn't tried to speak again. Not with sound. But she was watching. Every time Rourke moved, her ridge flickered. It pulsed brightest when he approached. When he passed behind her, the rear notes flared. Reflex? Defense mechanism? He couldn't be sure. She had no eyes. Yet she tracked him perfectly. He remembered training vids from his first tour. The Asari had been described as psionic mimics, able to absorb intent, pattern, even emotion. No one had ever proven it. Most evidence had burned in the cleansing vaults. He had seen one up close once. Alive for 7 seconds. Long enough to reach for him. He remembered the heat of that hand. She didn't reach for him. Not until the second night. He'd fallen asleep in the corner chair, rifle on his lap, fatigue drawing down like wet stone. At some point, she moved. The blanket slipped. She made no sound, but her hand touched his boot. When he woke, she was crouched inches away. Not threatening. Just close. He didn't startle. Just looked. She tilted her head. Light shifted across her skin, brilliant lines flowing down the arc of her arms. Then something happened in his mind. A flicker. Not thought. Not memory. A sensation, falling. A drop through air that wasn't his. Cold, weightless, filled with distant fire. A planet below, burning. Smoke curled around fractured pylons. Screams in a language without consonants. The feeling of flight, then loss. An entire species dimming like a flame sealed in glass. But also something else. A face. A child. Human. Charred. Sprawled in a collapsed orchard back on Mokatha's first moon. She was 8. Maybe 9. Half her skull missing. He remembered stepping over her, hands numb, gun overheating in his grip. He jerked back. The contact broke. She sagged to the floor, limbs folding. No aggression. No defense. Just exhaustion. He sat there, breath sharp in his throat, hands shaking. Then finally he spoke. What the hell are you? She didn't answer. But her ridge glowed steadily. As if she understood. He remained where he was, breathing carefully, listening to the wind scrape along the northern wall. It had returned, howling down from the ridge like a wounded animal. He looked at her again. The way her skin flickered in time with his heartbeat. The way her stillness seemed full of language. She wasn't dead. And she wasn't just alive. She was listening. By the third day, she began to echo him. It started with the simplest patterns. When Rourke adjusted the stove dial, she shifted her hands. When he took long steps across the room, her limbs mirrored the rhythm, delayed by seconds, as if buffering data from a corrupted stream. She sat motionless for hours, yet registered every flicker of his body language. Not just watching. Absorbing. He'd known mimicry before, field memories of Yasari scouts whispering back human speech, warping it like bird calls in a dead forest, but this was different. Slower. Closer. As if she wasn't learning about him, but calibrating to him. He no longer called her the thing. He hadn't given her a name, but in his internal cadence, muscle, breath, blink, he had accepted her. The human body always showed its hand before the mind caught up. He knew that. He'd used that. Long ago. That morning, he woke with her standing. She wasn't tall. Lithe, skeletal, suspended on limbs too precise to be comfortable. Her joints articulated with a triple pivot gait, unstable on Terran gravity but fluid within her own axis of control. Her skin had shed its chalky tone. Now it shimmered faintly like rain across glass. The glow of her ridge had softened, its pattern no longer chaotic but pulsing in coherent sequence. She faced the window. Not pressed to it. Not gazing. Just near it. As though proximity to open space brought some calibration. The forest beyond was motionless under a blanket of snow. Above, thin strands of aurora curled between the stars like veins of glowing quartz. Satellites moved slowly in the black, watching, maybe. Waiting. Rourke didn't speak. He stood, bones creaking, and poured boiled water into a dented cup. When he turned, she had moved. She stood near the old data shelf, a rack of glass panes, most dead, one still alive. The third pane from the bottom, flickering amber, held echoes of his daughter's voice. A backup transmission from a settlement school on Karen's outer rim. 5 seconds of laughter. A single question about the moons. Then static. The Yasari's hand hovered near it. He cleared his throat just slightly. Her hand retreated. Later that day, she began to speak. Not in words. In exhalations. Mimicked breath patterns. Tonal pulses at the edge of sound. Like sonar. But musical. He was checking the uplink tower's charge on the ridge when he heard it. A 5-note harmonic swelling from the cabin below. Not loud, but deliberate. When he returned, she was seated, hands in her lap, ridge glowing in a slow lateral pattern. He approached. She flinched, not in fear, but as if bracing for consequence. He knelt beside her. That song. That sound. No response. He reached for his belt. Pulled out an old reconnaissance slate, flat, cracked, dust-worn. Drew a rough map of the cabin interior. Pointed to himself, then to her. Then to the stove. She leaned forward. Placed a hand on the slate. Her touch lit it faintly. Then she drew. Not with clarity. Not with lines. With pulses. Bursts of light from her fingers that formed shapes Rourke couldn't parse, geometries that bent inward, spiraled, folded. Then she stopped. He stared. He wasn't meant to understand. That wasn't the point. She looked up at him. Her head tilted. Then her hand lifted and touched his chest. He didn't flinch this time. The world shifted again. It was not memory. It was architecture. He stood, not bodily, but perceiving within an impossible structure. Towers built from latticework fused with living bone. Gravity bent upward in a spiral. The walls pulsed with neural resonance, not decoration. They carried emotion, not pigment. He was inside her mind. Or near it. He staggered sideways. He heard voices, not words, not language, but intent. Memory was shared here like breath. Flashes of cities beneath green suns. Of council halls with translucent spires. Of the sky opening with Terran strikecraft screaming through the mesosphere. He turned. One chamber was different. It was smaller. Dim. A single point of light pulsed on the floor like a heartbeat encased in crystal. Above it hovered an object, warped and half-formed. A pendant. Or a name seal. He couldn't read it, but its sorrow pressed down like gravity. A child's presence clung to the memory space. Not seen. Felt. Then gone. Grief without scream. Loss without collapse. And always, always beneath it all came the feeling she had run. Not just fled. Run through ruin, through silence, through the echo of annihilation. Not fear. Duty. And now here. A small cabin above a frozen valley. The vision fractured. He gasped, falling to one knee. Cold cabin air returned. She had collapsed too, hands trembling, breath pulsing like wind through reeds. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The next day, Rourke lit the forge. He hadn't used it in months. It hissed back to life like an animal stirred from hibernation. The air filled with the tang of scorched flux and metal filings. The Yasari watched, motionless, as he soldered a broken comm plate and repaired the cabin's thermal barrier. She mimicked his breathing rhythm while he worked. He paused once, hand hovering above the flame, and stared at the hilt of a broken blade. Folded steel, custom forged. He carried it through the first siege on Adris Station. It was the last thing his squad commander gave him before the airlock fire. He hadn't touched it since. He hammered it flat. She tilted her head again, listening. Occasionally, her fingers rose to trace invisible patterns in the air. Not idle. Not meaningless. Rourke began to suspect they were writing. That night, as the snow thickened again, she pointed to the uplink display. Her ridge flared once, steady. Then dimmed. He ran a passive scan. Faint burst packet traffic along the old defense network's cold band. Not Terran. Not civilian. She was telling him they were being watched. She knew before he did. He moved the cot beside hers. Just close enough. Not for comfort. For recognition. His rifle stayed between them. But the silence changed. Not peace. Not trust. But understanding. When he lay back that night, she sang again. Not music. A modulation. Tones tuned to his breath. And this time, light came with it. Her ridge glowed in soft pulses, and with each harmonic swell, the shadows in the room shifted. The cabin's edges trembled, not visibly but in sensation. Like the walls remembered a shape they had once forgotten. Like the room briefly existed in both places, here and there. The sound wasn't for him, but it reached him. He closed his eyes and let the resonance carry him. The storm broke just before midnight. Rourke woke to pressure. Air pressed tight against the cabin walls, as if the mountain itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Ice hammered the north face in waves. The seams groaned. A gust peeled a loose panel from the eave. He felt the vibration more than heard it. Snow punched sideways through the black, visible only as static in the flickering uplink display. She stood in the dark, not frightened, not hiding, just present. The harmonic pattern along her ridge flickered steadily, casting pale blue ripples across the low ceiling. Her limbs were folded beneath her, head tilted toward the storm as if listening for a signal embedded in the chaos. Rourke sat upright. The rifle was at arm's reach. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stood, crossed the room, and checked the outer seal's integrity. The reading blinked yellow, partial compromise. He shut the internal hatch and pulled down the thermal curtain. The cold was working through the welds, microfractures blooming across the viewport, each a jagged petal of frost. Behind him, she moved. No sound, no suddenness, just a new presence closer to his. Her fingers extended, hovered near the uplink terminal. A faint pulse ran from her ridge into her arms. The screen flickered, briefly, then steadied. He watched her face, or what stood in its place. The ridge shimmered, an entire lexicon of color and cadence compressed into a vertical band of emotion. She was saying something, not to him, to the storm, or the things that rode within it. "Are they coming?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't answer. She turned slightly. Her hand rose not to touch him but to show. A slow, spiraling motion in the air. Not a threat. Pattern. Pursuit. He nodded. By morning, the cabin was sealed in ice. The windows had vanished beneath a crust of white 2 hands thick. The uplink tower groaned under wind pressure but held. No signals had returned. No movement. But the cold had changed. It was quiet. Not the silence of snow. Not the stillness of mountain fog. A held breath. Predator's hush. Inside, the cabin had dimmed into perpetual dusk. The solar arrays were choked. Backup power rationed light by function. No soft ambient panels. No workspace bloom. Just red strips over door frames and the stove's pulse coil, flickering like a dying heart. She hadn't eaten. Not in any Terran sense. But she moved with more certainty now. Her joints no longer trembled. Her breath came evenly, rhythmically, and the ridge on her face now pulsed in slow cycles that echoed his own vitals. When he stood near her, the pattern changed, aligned. He began tracking it, not for data, for understanding. They passed time without speaking. He mended gear, cleaned weapons, ran diagnostics on the uplink, bypassing burned-out cores with soldered jumpers. She watched everything, mimicked the work in the air with her fingers, sometimes improving it without touching the tools. Once, she corrected his sequence, reordered a capacitor node silently, flashing the correction across her ridge. He didn't speak, just nodded. By the third day of lockdown, frost had grown inside the walls. It bloomed like crystal fungus around the bolt heads and seams. Even the stove radiated uneven warmth, spitting heat in metallic bursts, unable to hold rhythm. He used the forge only when necessary now. This time, it was the energy cradle, housing for an old tricell he'd shelved after the siege of Moleth. It still bore the insignia of the 12th Recon. Scorched, pitted. He hesitated before picking it up. Inside the cradle compartment was a folded strip of thermal cloth wrapped around a faded brass insignia. Yasari Human Détente badge, issued before the vault fires, before the betrayals. He had kept it, buried it. He stared at it for a long time. Then he dropped it into the forge. The badge hissed as it vanished into slag. She stayed closer to the heat, never too near. He suspected her biological systems operated within narrow tolerances. Her thermals weren't like his, more electromagnetic than chemical. And when she entered rest cycles, the cabin lights dimmed unbidden. One night the light failed. The heat coil sputtered. Energy cell, depleted. The secondary filament couldn't hold ambient warmth. Ice spread across the wall seams. His breath fogged in bursts. She moved closer, not out of need, out of logic. Her core emitted low-band thermal resonance, a side effect of her internal process. He sat with her in the center of the cabin floor, their backs inches apart. She hummed, a long, low resonance that vibrated through the floorboards, not as music but as balance, a frequency that softened the air. Rourke leaned his head back until it almost touched hers. Not quite, not yet. He closed his eyes. In the hum, he heard a battlefield. Not his, hers. The world she'd fled was called youth, or something close to it. In her resonance, names were emotional tones more than syllables. The name tasted like morning frost and grief. Youth was already dying before the war. Not from age, from overuse. Their psychic communion, once a cultural strength, had become recursive. Emotion fed into emotion, memory into memory. The Yasari lost boundaries. They lost selves. She had been part of a last-generation cast, bred not to join, but to witness. Record. Archive. She had seen her own cities die, and when the Terran fleets came, she alone did not scream. She listened. Her role had not been to resist. It had been to remember. When Rourke opened his eyes, the hum had ended. Her ridge flickered dimly. She was asleep, not inert, dreaming. Light shifted subtly along her arms, through her fingers, each filament mapping something internal, something alive. She pulsed in silence like a seed waiting for thaw. With each pulse, a faint shimmer ran across her skin. Not color, not heat, memory, echoes of images not fully formed. Trees that weren't Terran, skies without gravity, voices spoken in patterns of light. He wrapped a second blanket around her. Not for her, for himself. At dawn, the uplink woke. Just for a moment. One frame of signal. A burst packet embedded in static. Rourke parsed it line by line. Unmarked. Off-grid. Military codebase. No request, no handshake. Just 4 coordinates. Landing vector. ETA, 36 hours. The coordinates pointed less than 2 clicks from his position. South slope. Old clear-cut basin from the colonial timber rush. Flat, exposed, still visible through drone eyes. He stood. She was already awake. The glow along her ridge was still, like light behind closed eyes. He crossed the room, sat beside her. "Company's coming," he said quietly. No reaction. Then finally her head turned. Slowly, deliberately, the pulse along her ridge changed color. Not warning. Resolution. The drone arrived ahead of schedule. Rourke spotted it from the ridge overlook at dawn. No exhaust trail, no optical shimmer. Just absence. A wedge of black stitched against the snow clouds, moving like a drop of oil through water. It didn't broadcast a signature. It didn't need to. That shape belonged to Earth's Covert Systems Division. Designed for deep insertion war zones. Designed for termination. It flew low, scanning with fields beyond visible light, gravitic sonar, particle spray mapping, resonance tracing. Civilian eyes would see nothing. But Rourke had trained with these machines. He'd once been the blueprint behind their shadow. He slung the old longscope across his shoulder and descended to the cabin, breath tight in his chest. He didn't speak. She was already waiting. The harmonic pulse along her ridge had changed. Not frantic, condensed. Focused. Her arms were drawn close to her core, legs folded beneath her in a containment posture he hadn't seen before. The air around her shimmered faintly, not from heat, but charge. Vectors confirmed, Rourke muttered. Descent profile suggests triangulated sweep. Wide arc. No broadcast. Her ridge pulsed once. Sharp blue. Agreement. She moved to the uplink terminal and laid a hand across its dormant surface. Her touch sank beneath the outer plate, light spiraling into the edges like capillaries. She fed it a false pulse, then bled the internal batteries dry. One more signature gone. They worked without speaking. Rourke dismantled the uplink relay. She disabled the passive energy signatures in the wall seams. Together they moved cabin equipment into the crawl space beneath the eastern floor plate. He reinforced the access panel with black cloth and insulated mesh. She layered resonance bursts to confuse detection fields. They erased themselves. The forge was extinguished. The stove cooled to ambient. All light came from a single chemical lamp burning behind layered ceramic, old siege trick to mask thermal bloom. 30 minutes to breach radius. He checked the sidearm, then the bolt action, the last Terran weapon that still worked without internal guidance. Her gaze followed the movement. She didn't flinch at the sound of loading. But her ridge dimmed. He paused, then set the rifle down. The drone dropped below cloud level without warning. No sonic boom. Just presence. Rourke stood at the perimeter of the tree lean, rifle across his chest, his coat stiff with ice. He could see its shape now, triangular hull, dark matte skin, no visible propulsion. It skimmed low, just meters above the trees, scanning with something deeper than light. It slowed near the clearing. Held. Drifted. Then settled. No landing struts. Just a stillness that touched the air wrong. A hatch split open. Nothing emerged. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then it spoke. Not out loud. Into his bones. A resonance transmission tuned to legacy combat implants. Elias Rourke. He flinched. The name burned like a brand. Your location is confirmed. Deliver the entity. Observation window, 60 minutes. Non-compliance will be recorded as final. The signal cut. He exhaled, vapor curling against the wind. The trees around the clearing stood unnaturally still. Birds had vanished. Even the wind seemed to bow away from the drone's shape. He turned and walked back into the woods. Back inside, she hadn't moved. But her ridge had changed. The blue was gone. Now it pulsed white. Memory. Resolve. Acceptance. He crouched beside her. They won't talk again. She didn't respond. But her fingers twitched in a slow, spiraling rhythm. He understood. She was giving him a choice. He stepped away and opened the old weapons drawer beneath the bunk. Inside lay remnants of a life that no longer fit. A military seal ring, a rusted data drive, a folded photo of someone he'd stopped remembering by name. And a locator tag. A Terran issue failsafe. Standard issue for post-war commanders in isolation, coded to trigger an orbital fire point should their neural signal vanish. He stared at it, then crushed it under his boot. For the next hour, the world held its breath. Rourke cleaned the old rifle by lamplight. Not to use it. To remember the weight. She sat across from him, unmoving. Dreamless. Awake. When the time came, he stood. Moved to the door. Held it open. She rose. No sound. No question. Only motion. Together, they walked into the snow. Their footprints dissolved behind them in the wind. They moved past the tree line. Past the perimeter beacons. Through the black trees and down the frozen wash toward the clearing. Her ridge pulsed in intervals, now faint bursts of light that shimmered across falling snow. The patterns were not uniform. She was speaking. Not to him. Not entirely. Just leaving a trail of herself. Like seeds in the dark. The drone was still there. Waiting. Its hatch remained open like a mouth. Rourke stepped forward. Not fast. Not slow. Just present. She followed. Inside the drone, the light changed. Not bright. Not cold. a spectrum only she could see. Her ridge lit in response. The interior was quiet. Circular. Smooth. No controls. No screens. Just a soft hum and walls that pulsed slightly with her entry as though the vessel recognized her. She paused. Her ridge shimmered across violet, then green. Rourke stopped at the edge of the ramp. She turned. One final pulse. He saw it. Felt it. A memory. His own, given back to him. Not the war. Not the loss. A moment. A firelight in a childhood hut. The smell of burning sapwood. The sound of laughter not heard in decades. She gave him that. Then stepped inside. The hatch sealed. The drone lifted. It did not burn the forest. It did not erase the ridge. It rose in silence and vanished into the cloud. Rourke stood alone in the clearing. His coat stiff with frost. The rifle cradled in his arms. The wind returned slowly. He could smell pine again. Hear the creak of ice loosening on bark. The world sounded larger than before. The place where she had stood shimmered faintly in his eyes, though there was no trace. He did not move. Not for a long time. Then he exhaled, turned, and walked back through the snow. The cabin had never felt larger. Rourke stepped through the threshold with frost still cracking off his boots, rifle slung but idle, coat peeled halfway from his shoulders like molted skin. The stove was dead. The forge remained cold. The silence was no longer sterile, it breathed. The absence of her was everywhere. A hollow where her pulse had lived, where light had rippled through the corners of the walls. The resonance she had once emitted still haunted the seams of the cabin like a scent half-remembered. He didn't light the fire. He didn't need to. Outside, the wind turned. He marked the time by the sunless days. The snowfall thickened but softened, no longer the slicing wind burst of the purge storm. The weather turned inward like breath drawn slow. He rose with it, moved through routine without urgency. Each morning he checked the ridge. Not for return, but out of reflex. There was no signal, no contrail, no distortion in the trees. But the act mattered. It grounded him. He repaired the uplink tower. Not to broadcast, just to listen. The node was cracked, its internal stabilizer warped from the last coil burst. He dismantled the housing and rewired it with salvaged flux lines. His hands remembered the shapes, the solder points, the language of survival spoken through quiet labor. The scanner powered on after 6 hours. Faint, weak, but it pulsed. He didn't upload anything. He just listened. Daylight faded faster now, even without sun. The cabin's interior warmed briefly during the mid-cycle thaw, then refroze with nightfall. Rourke kept to a schedule: repair one thing, burn 1 calorie ration, read 1 signal arc. He studied the coordinates SCIFI had projected, the strange pulse map she had patterned across his data slate. They were nonlinear, asymmetrical, but not chaotic. Over time, they began to resolve. The pattern formed a lattice. A web. Not military, not flight paths. Communion routes. They were fragments of old Yasari resonance relays, neural lattice corridors they had once used to share memory over planetary distances. Each node correlated with abandoned exostructures buried beneath Terran colonial sites. Places burned from history. Places no one returned to. Except him. On the 8th night, something broke. Not outside. Not storm or seal. Inside. The cabinet beneath the comm panel, once sealed with rusted fasteners, groaned open with the pressure shift. Inside, a forgotten field core, battery, beacon, recording node. All dead. Except the recorder. He activated it. It played 3 seconds of corrupted data, static, then his voice. Younger. Strained. Not enough time. But if someone finds this, she's not what they think. She's different. I saw it. In the way she watched. The way she waited. He didn't remember recording it. But he knew when it was made. The first night he saw her. The memory landed hard, but not as pain. As confirmation. That even then, days before understanding, he'd already begun to change. That night, he relit the forge. The element hissed as warmth returned. Old smoke, resin, and oxidation rose from the frame. His fingers trembled at first, but the heat steadied them. Sweat bloomed between his shoulder blades as the warmth soaked into muscle hardened by months of cold stillness. The ache in his hands deepened until it wasn't pain but pressure, something being pushed loose from inside. He didn't rebuild a weapon. He shaped something else. A vessel. Small. No larger than a human skull. Forged from alloy, glass, and fragments of her spent resonance wire, which still shimmered faintly in the forge light. Each time the wire touched metal, it sang, barely audible, but there. A hum like distant breath. The forge itself seemed to mimic it, its pulse steadying in rhythm. He layered the interior with pulse ceramic, a memory-holding composite designed to trap frequency. Into it he wove sound. Not speech. Just echoes. The last modulation she'd sung beside the stove. The hum that had quieted the storm. The sequence she'd used to mimic his breath the first time they slept in silence. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew how it felt. And feeling was enough. The forge dimmed. He wrapped the vessel in survival cloth and carried it to the ridge. The old upling shadow still lay there, faint grooves in the snow where antenna roots had once drunk SCIFI. But this place had a deeper history. Before the war, the ridge had been a signal mirror, one of the first reflective ground stations for Terran planetary networks. When the severance burned the lattice down, the mirror became a grave. Dozens of signalers were buried beneath it, their memory compressed into forgotten logs. She had chosen this spot to die. Or to leave. He dug a small pit with gloved hands. No tools. Just breath and motion. The soil was iron-hard under the snow. Every scoop stung his palms. But he welcomed the pain. It sharpened the shape of the moment. The cairn was made of black stone and snow glass, materials that didn't hold heat, didn't change in time. They were a note, durable and silent. Like the memory he wanted to leave. He placed the vessel in the center and sealed the cairn. No inscription. No glyph. Just form. The wind circled. The sky above was colorless. But the forge's warmth still clung to his skin, and behind his ribs a final modulation echoed, not as a sound, but as weight. He stood there until his legs numbed. Because fires once lit, if real, never go out. They just burn quietly, waiting to be seen. The melt came without warning. Not as warmth, but as surrender. Ice loosened its grip on the mountain in quiet increments, drip by drip, like the exhale of something ancient and buried. Rourke woke to the sound of water finding old paths. Tiny trickles down window seams. Soft cracks along the cabin's joists. And beneath it all, a subterranean groan rising through stone, the earth stretching in its sleep. It had been 33 days since the drone departed. He logged them not to count down, but to witness. Each tick on the data slayed away to keep the silence honest. The marks were uneven. Some carved deep, others light enough to vanish in cold breath. But each was true. That morning, he felt it in his boots, first wetness where there hadn't been. The ice under the floor had finally begun to recede. By midday, the stream west of the ridge was audible again, a thin, hungry whisper threading through thawed stone. He climbed the ridge. No ships. No drones. No lights in orbit. Just the splay of sky so wide and pale it seemed scraped clean. But something had changed. The cairn was warm. He knelt beside it, bare hand to black stone. The heat wasn't radiant. It didn't come from the vessel. It was residual. The stone held memory. Held frequency. It hummed faintly when touched, like a sleeping coil. There were microfractures now, a hairline splits in the surface of the cairn's central stone. From beneath them, a faint light pulsed. Not bright. Not unnatural. Just present. Like breath through cloth. He lowered his head. Closed his eyes. Listened. There were no words. But there was intent. The vessel was full. She had sent something back. The forge burned long that night. He dismantled the forge's old resonance cradle and reassembled it with care, coaxial threading, layered ceramic filters, ion-stabilized mesh. The vessel slid perfectly into the new housing. Its pulse crystal glowed with soft color, cycling through blue and violet in rhythm with the cabin's ambient temperature. The signal wasn't data. It wasn't linear. It was memory. Layered. Textured. She had left him a message. Not for understanding. For remembering. The first sequence bloomed like a call. Harmonics tangled with deep tone impressions. A child's laughter, not Terran, not human, followed by wind rushing through hollow towers. Then silence, broken by a descending pulse. Pain. Grief. Not described. Imprinted. He staggered back. Not from volume. From weight. The vessel was full of them. Yasari not named, but felt. Each tone of life once bound to communion. Each pause a moment between loss and recollection. A map of mourning laid bare not on paper, but on bone. He spent the night writing. Not to copy. To anchor. His hands shook. His spine ached from the cold and from the pressure the vessel seemed to exert just by existing. His eyes watered until it blurred the data. Twice he vomited. Once he woke from a brief blackout, face pressed to the floor, forehead hot with fever. But still he wrote. He built a lexicon. Cross-referenced modulations with known Yasari tonal registers gleaned from pre-war encounter logs, scavenged linguistics cores, even fragments recovered during his own missions. It was incomplete. Sloppy. Human. But it worked. By dawn, he had a frame. A structure. A way to respond. He activated the uplink logs for the first time in 2 years. Not to transmit location. To echo. He crafted a pulse sequence 19 notes long, threaded with background hum, tuned to the vessel's ceramic decay patterns. The final chord carried her modulation, his breath mapped into its rhythm, her harmonics layered with his own heartbeat. When he played it back, the sound was barely audible, but it sank into the skin, like a truth long buried beneath language. He set it loose on the long-wave bands. Then he waited. The mountain watched. For days later, the far ridge blinked. Not visible light. A fold in resonance, barely detectable, but present. A counter-sequence. Slower. Lower. Almost cautious. He froze. Then answered. Over the next week, 5 new nodes activated. One south of Iris Station, long buried in snowmelt. One near the dead belt of the Muroth cradle. Another in the shattered fields of Vex 9, where glass had replaced soil. Each pulse was different. Not just reply. Identity. Some mourned. Some sang. Some tested the lattice like animals sniffing old trails. He answered each with care. He fed them Sevi's tones calibrated through his own breath. Her last sequence by the stove, retuned against wind harmonics from his cabin walls. Her modulation paired with one of his Warfield chants, softened and inverted. The network grew. The cairn changed with it. The glow beneath it seems brightened slightly with each relay found. At night, when the wind stilled, he could swear it sang, not a sound, but a shift in atmosphere. A warmth behind the bones. They were not dead. Not all. Scattered. Buried. Dim. But not gone. She had opened the gate. He had lit the signal. And across the forgotten fractures of the world, they were listening. It began with the trees. The forest below the ridge had always been stunted. Scrub-thin birches, needle-bone pines. Their roots choked by permafrost. Branches hunched in submission to long winters. But 2 weeks after the final resonance pulse, Rourke noticed a change. Not in color, not in bloom, in posture. They stood differently, not taller, not greener, just aware, as if the ground beneath them had turned. He dismissed it at first. A trick of thaw and tilt, maybe runoff triggering root expansion. But then he traced their alignment. 5 trees, each rooted along an invisible arc. Not random. A perfect mirroring of the resonance lattice he'd mapped into the slate. The same curvature. The same node intervals. They weren't growing. They were responding. On a windless morning, he walked among them. The air was thick with loam and thawed spores. The frost line had receded, but unevenly, sleeves of softened earth woven through hardpan like scars in flesh. Beneath his boots, the ground breathed. Not metaphorically. It rose and fell in minuscule pulses. A syncopated rhythm. He paused beside the tallest birch. Laid a gloved hand on its bark. It vibrated. Faint. Like a heartbeat trapped beneath woodgrain. The pulse was old, not mechanical. Rourke closed his eyes. Let it move up his arm, through his shoulder, into his ribs. It matched the modulation from the cairn. Softer now. Diffused. Not signal. Not broadcast. Memory. Alive. That night he brought the vessel. Wrapped in treated cloth. The forge-crafted sphere still shimmered faintly. He set it in the grove's central hollow. An indentation in the thawed earth where no tree had dared root. The soil was black and flecked with crystal. Moisture clung to its surface like breath on skin. When the vessel touched it, the ground accepted. Not swallowed. Received. The glow brightened. Resonance shivered up the trees in thin blue threads. Their bark cracked like wet stone, shedding flecks of dead skin. Roots twitched. Sap pulsed visibly through semi-translucent veins beneath bark. The soil shifted not as collapse, but as rearrangement. Above, branches stirred without wind. The grove inhaled, then held. For a moment, Rourke saw the entire field glow. A networked heartbeat. He fell to one knee, head ringing, not from sound, but from a harmonic dissonance between his blood and the ground. Passed, but left him trembling. The next morning, everything had changed. Rourke marked the trees, etched number runes along their bark, mapped their spacing, charted growth angles. None had moved physically, but each held a different frequency signature. One emitted a high, looping modulation, gentle, like lullaby tones folded through fog. Another pulsed erratically, as if remembering pain. The third was nearly silent, but resonated at low frequencies that shook snow from nearby branches. It wasn't transmission. It was expression. He began to respond. Not with equipment, with himself. Each morning he would sit in the hollow vessel beside him and breathe. Steady, rhythmic inhalations. Sometimes he hummed. Sometimes he simply thought in silence. The grove responded accordingly, wind changing direction, snow crystals forming patterns across exposed roots. The resonance had become biological. By the seventh day, his dreams began to change. No longer fragments, now sequences, spaces. He dreamed of a garden the size of continents, vines made of thought stretching between sky fortresses and ground-rooted shrines. He walked among beings like SCIFI but taller, older. They moved in spirals. Their skin emitted light not for vision, but for memory. One stood among them. She turned. Her ridge glowed white. She did not speak, but he felt her hand on his chest. When he woke, the grove had grown. New trees had risen. Overnight, saplings without seed pods. Roots that bent toward resonance lines drawn in soil. They shimmered faintly at night, not visibly, but as subtle shifts in air pressure. Rourke walked through them like moving through breath. He collected bark samples, plotted chemical changes, found microfilaments in the xylem that shouldn't exist, organic compounds resembling neural sheaths. He had seen these before, in Yasari Corp's archives. The trees were becoming memory conduits, not passive, reconstructive. By the third week, Rourke couldn't sleep. Not from exhaustion, from immersion. The grove sang at night, not in pitch but in modulation, vibrations that settled into his bones. He no longer dreamed of battle. He dreamed of cities beneath moons he'd never seen, of conversations without sound, of grief held communally in circles of light. The resonance bled into the cabin. Tools hummed faintly. The stove refused to start unless he entered the room in silence. His rifle, a relic, warped slightly at the grip. Not visibly, but it felt thinner. The past was being rewritten, or remembered differently. He began losing words. Sometimes mid-sentence his thoughts stuttered. Language drifted. He spoke aloud to empty air to recalibrate. Once, he awoke with strange symbols scratched into the floor beside his cot. On the 22nd night, SCIFI came again. She stood alone on a high cliff, her ridge dim, her hands cupped around a flickering light. Behind her, an entire city pulsed like an aurora. She opened her hands, and the light became music. He woke with wet cheeks, and no voice. The next day, the grove changed again. On the northern edge, where the frost once held longest, a silhouette stood among the roots. Unmoving, watching, slender, upright, not Terran. Their skin shimmered with faint circuitry, embedded resonance nodes beneath the collarbone. Their face held no ridge, but light pulsed faintly along the temples in SCIFI's cadence. They were not Yasari. They were new, formed in the in-between. Rourke stepped forward. He raised a hand, palm outward. The being mirrored it, then closed their fingers one by one. Pattern. He recognized it. SCIFI's first modulation. The one from the cabin stove. He lowered his hand, took one step closer. The grove pulsed once. A single low exhale that echoed through snow, bark, and bone. Then quiet. They did not speak, but they remembered him, and that was enough. They came at dusk, not from the sky but the earth. 3 more of them emerged from the treeline, crossing the grove's outer edge just as the last amber light threaded through the canopy. They moved in slow, deliberate arcs, neither hiding nor hurrying, as if they were returning to a place that had waited for them. Their silhouettes broke the symmetry of the forest, but the grove did not resist. It bent toward them. Their forms varied. One stood tall and narrow, limbs elongated with a grace more insect than humanoid. Another hunched low, moving on multiple jointed legs, its posture resembling a crawling centaur. The third, smallest, was serpentine, its upper torso fluid and boneless, with eyes embedded in its shoulders. Yet all bore the same resonance. Glowing lattice nodes threaded beneath their translucent skin, pulsing with an identical frequency. The cadence was unmistakable. They were not emissaries. They were extensions, fragments of what the grove had become. They didn't speak, didn't offer gesture or greeting. They simply existed, and the grove moved to meet them. Vines recoiled, making space. The soil flattened in concentric rings around their path. Tree limbs curled upward as if to see. Even the air shifted. The wind turned circular, drawing warmth from beneath the frost line. Rourke stood still at the vessel's cradle, his breath visible in the golden dusk, the forged relic warm at his hip. He didn't speak. He no longer needed to. They approached him slowly. The tall one first, then the hunched, then the serpentine. They circled him, not close, not menacing, like moons shifting around a gravitational center. The tall one paused and raised an arm. Its fingers, though alien, folded one by one into a looped gesture, a modulation sigil. Clean, intentional, precise. Rourke recognized it instantly. The pattern SCIFI had once drawn in condensation on the cabin window, just before the storm. The others joined the movement, tracing new symbols into the air with luminous filaments from their fingers. The overlapping light formed a cloud of semiotic rhythm. Not words, not images, but invitation. A path offered, a request. He nodded. They led him beneath the grove. Not through a tunnel but a root-formed corridor, a spiral descent of living matter. The earth had opened, not torn. Lattices of mycelium arched overhead, interwoven with light strands like synapses firing through soil. As he stepped forward, his boots triggered dim bursts of phosphorescence, each footprint causing the floor to exhale a faint resonance hum. The temperature shifted, not cold, but deeper. Rourke removed his gloves instinctively, his fingertips tingling. The walls felt alive. Their breath was measured. The tunnel curved downward, narrowing before widening again. They passed what looked like memorials, small alcoves grown into the bark, inside which fragments glowed. A strip of cloth, a curved bone, an old ocular implant half subsumed by moss. Each hummed at its own frequency. None were identical. Every one was a life remembered. The passage opened into a chamber vast enough to forget gravity. It wasn't empty. It was aware. Tree roots hundreds of meters long curled through the walls and ceiling like petrified storm clouds, veined with silver resonance strands. A shallow pool circled the center, glowing faintly blue beneath a haze of bioluminescent mist. Hanging above it all was the root light. A tree, yes, but not one meant to bear fruit or shelter. It stood hollow, massive, its trunk wider than the forge and cabin combined. Its surface shimmered like obsidian in water, skin light flowing beneath its bark in translucent pulses. The branches didn't reach up. They reached inward, folding into themselves in spirals. Rourke didn't need explanation. This was the memory core. He stepped forward, guided not by gesture but by gravity. He placed one hand on its surface, and the world unfolded. Not visions, transference. He felt it first in his spine. The hum crawled upward, unspooling behind his eyes, lighting nerve paths that hadn't fired in years. His breath caught, his heartbeat stilled. He wasn't remembering, he was being remembered. Youth, before collapse. Cities strung between canyons like glass cords. Towers tuned to solar wind. Children weaving emotion into song in amphitheaters carved from stone. The Asari didn't pass stories down. They passed presence. Then the arrival. Terran dropcraft. Orders. Precaution turned to panic. Missiles veined with fear. Defensive fire misconstrued as preemptive strike. The sky breaking open. The severance. Not a weapon. A severing of the lattice. The psychic bleedback ignited entire cities in their own grief. The silence that followed was worse than war. And amid it all SCIFI, last of her caste. A witness, not a warrior. She didn't run. She recorded. Fled only when the archive inside her became more valuable than the world burning around it. The memory shifted. Rourke saw himself. Younger. Cold. Hardened. A weapon in Terran skin. Crouched in the ruins of Muroth Cradle. Dragging wounded from burning hallways. Firing into shadows. issuing commands he would forget, ending lives he hadn't been old enough to judge. Then the cabin, then her, not as an enemy, as a seed. He remembered her first modulation, her silence, the pause before trust. He saw how they had grown toward each other, slow, reciprocal, not across battle lines, but beneath them. Their harmonics had aligned before either understood. He pulled his hand free. The root light pulsed once, its glow turning from blue to violet. Then it pulsed again, fainter, delayed. An echo. It had recorded him. The three beings waited at the pool's edge. One stepped forward and reached inside the rootlight's hollow core, withdrawing a shard of translucent mineral, no larger than a stone. It shimmered in his direction. Within its heart flickered a dual pulse. Sevi's tone. His own. They offered it to him. He took it. The shard felt warm. Not hot. Not bright. No. As his fingers curled around it, the three beings extended their own hands, not to touch but to mirror. Their resonance harmonized with the shard. In that shared frequency, Rourke felt something ripple across his skin. A brief memory not his own. Wind in an ocean tree field, a hand reaching out, a moment just before joy. Then silence. They bowed their heads, not in reverence, in unity. The return was shorter. The grove above had changed again. Branches taller, roots exposed, canopy woven tighter overhead. As he emerged, he saw the stars had shifted. Not in position, in expression. New constellations traced resonance arcs across the sky, shaped not by Terran astronomy but by lattice broadcast. Signal nets rising from node to node. A web across continents. He stood in silence. The shard hummed in his palm. The beings did not follow. They lingered at the grove's threshold, watching. Not possessively. Not even with curiosity. With recognition. He turned. In the distance, the cabin waited. The roofline sagged slightly. The comm panel blinked once, seeking uplink it no longer needed. A thread of smoke curled from the forge's chimney. It smelled of iron and cedar resin. He had lived there, but he no longer belonged to it. Behind him, the root light pulsed again, not as farewell, as invitation and promise. Rourke walked the ridge one final time. The wind had changed, no longer sharp or searching, but low and circular, carrying warmth from beneath the soil, not the sky. Snow no longer held dominion here. It fell as mist now, suspended in sheets of rising breath from the forest floor. The sky glowed not with sun, but with lattice flare, faint resonance arcs that bent light through the canopy like veins of memory threading the atmosphere. Trees had shifted their posture again. They no longer leaned with the weight of winter or bent away from frost. Now they leaned toward him, not in deference but as witness. Their branches bore resonance filaments, gleaming like frosted wires, each one humming a unique modulation. As he passed, some adjusted their pitch. It was not music. It was recognition. He paused at the cairn. The vessel still pulsed beneath the black stone. Its signature was deeper now, slow, steady, syncopated. It was no longer a beacon or a container. It was a seed. Its purpose was no longer to recall. It was to be recalled. Rourke pressed his hand to the cairn's top stone. The surface was warm. The hum shifted to match his breath. He whispered something, though he didn't know what language it belonged to. The stone accepted it. Then he stood and turned toward the cabin. Inside, the forge had burned low, but its heat no longer clawed. It radiated gently now, the kind of warmth found in animal breath or held hands. The datapad beside it flickered, the last coordinate lattice SCIFI had ever drawn still visible but not frozen. The lines rippled gently now, as if responding to nearby presence. New arcs formed and dissolved like the roots of trees testing the earth. Across the screen, pulses overlapped. Sequences he hadn't input. Shapes he didn't recognize. Voices. The uplink relay blinked. Not once, but continuously. A low thread of energy drifted through it, connecting not to orbit but to the root light. Not to Earth. Not to command. To the lattice. To her. He didn't answer. Not yet. He walked the cabin one last time. He did not gather gear. He had no pack. No rifle. He walked for memory, not for reclaim. The chair where SCIFI had once folded herself, mimicry tight and deliberate. The wall panel she'd traced with her fingertips, mapping vibration through grain. The steel mug she'd turned into an impromptu resonance bowl to simulate Yasari breath cadence. He stopped by the cot. For a moment he reached toward the drawer, fingers hovering just above the edge. The motion was muscle memory. Comfort. The drawer that had once held his reasons for surviving. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside, the Terran seal ring. The mission data drive. The photo of his squad, long faded and curled at the edges. His thumb brushed the ring. A breath held, then released. He closed the drawer and did not look back. Outside, the air had changed. The forest canopy shimmered like memory filmed through ice. Light no longer filtered from above, but radiated from beneath the bark of the oldest trees. The root light's glow now spanned kilometers, its pulses flickering across treetop veins. He felt their echo beneath his boots, the way a heartbeat is felt in the wrists. Other groves had awakened. He knew this. Not from uplink. From resonance. The signal lattice had restructured itself. SCIFI's memory, passed through him, had become something larger, a distributed communion of biological signal and harmonic intelligence. Trees had become nodes. Soil had become medium. The wind carried not only scent, but intent. He stepped into the snow and walked. Not away. Not forward. Through. The grove parted. 5 beings waited. The original 3 stood as before, tall, hunched, serpentine. But with them now were 2 more. One floated slightly above the ground, winged but still, its feathers crystalline, vibrating at a frequency that pressed against the edges of thought. The other was spherical, rimmed with modulation bands, its pulse sequence a perfect inverse of SCIFI's earliest tones. Not mimicry. Reply. They made no sound. But they welcomed him. The harmonics bent toward him. He carried the shard. Not as tool. As self. The root light uncoiled. Not cracked. Not split. Unfurled. A spiral opened at its base, not dug but grown, lit from within by soft memory light. As it opened, the air thickened with humidity and heat. A breathless stillness fell over the grove. Resonance bled into the fog like pollen. The scent was familiar. Burned resin. Old metal. Cedar. Her. The walls were formed from thoughtwood, layers of biological signal and preserved resonance. Each step down was met with a shift in tone, like walking through a memory that remade itself with his breath. He did not hesitate. He walked into the light. The deeper he went, the less weight he carried. The memory of cold. The taste of rations. The sound of dying. They peeled from him like old skin, not erased, but returned. Given back to the soil. He passed chambers lined with bioluminescent mist. Inside, others waited. Not beings. Not yet. Echoes. Moments. Scenes from the lattice still reassembling themselves. He felt them flicker through him, a child's first breath in a resonance pool, the funeral song of a fallen city, SCIFI's laughter, not out loud, but in the way her ridge once brightened as she watched fire. At the deepest chamber, she waited. Not her form. Her essence. SCIFI stood at the root light's heart, shaped now by lattice and memory. Her skin shimmered with patterns he couldn't name, ridges no longer anatomical but harmonic. She had become part of the structure, not consumed, not trapped. Integrated. Her presence radiated through every surface. Her hand lifted. Not gesture. Invitation. But as her fingers moved, they traced a shape he remembered. The same pattern she had once drawn on the fogged glass of the cabin window. He mirrored her. The shard pulsed in his palm. So did the root light. So did she. He stepped forward. When they touched, the lattice ignited. Not as fire. As signal. Across the world, groves bloomed. Resonance towers long buried flickered to life. Terran satellites blinked with unresolved codes. An Earth beyond its quiet, its cities, its fear are heard. Not an attack. Not a plea. A presence. Returned. In a dark control room beneath a flooded bunker, a Terran technician sat upright as his console lit with signals not seen in 30 years. In a tower in New Oslo, a child looked up as a line of light threaded across the clouds and the wind shifted to a melody no instrument could mimic. On an orbiting relay, a machine blinked once, then began broadcasting in tones no one had programmed. Earth heard. And paused. The chamber sealed itself. The root light dimmed. There was no burst. No scream. Only silence. And from silence. Continuance. Above, the snowfall ceased. The sky cleared. The wind stilled. In the grove, one last pulse echoed. Not from the tree. From the ground itself. A tone that matched no known language. But meant, we are still here. And always were.